Welcome to What's Left, a weekly political discussion challenging the mainstream left. I'm Eduardo, a co-host, teacher and socialist Andy Lipson, and socialist Kenny Cepeda. We're online at what'sleftpodcast.com. You can find that link to our site in the episode notes. You can also find my personal social media handle as at Don Eduardo on Instagram. Please subscribe, rate, review, turn on your notifications, and share your favorite episode where we found this episode. We also have shirts, merch. If you'd like, you can always contact us at our blog. Thank you. All right. Well, we're joined today by John Klyczek, our Jake, the author of School World Order, The Technocratic Globalization of Corporatized Education by Day Books, and he is the contributor of two New Politics, the Center for Research on Globalization, Op-Ed News, the Intrepid Report, and the Dissident Voice, and of course, Unlimited Hangout. Yeah, welcome back, of course, to you are our family. What's Left family, Jake?
Always good to be here, family.
Yeah. Well, since you're with us now, you have to tolerate and withstand and join us in these shout-outs that this Andrew Lipson is doing, that he is being asked to do over and over and over and over again.
Yeah. Jake,
so
Jake,
bear with us.
Oh, I'm sorry. Jake, have you seen some of our recent episodes where I've had to do shout-outs for middle schoolers?
I saw one. Saw yeah.
Well, now I'm on the hook generally every week, although this shout out does not, this student, I've actually talked about before. His name is Fernando. But I'm kind of actually choosing to shout him out because he asked last week, but this week he didn't ask. He gave me a card for Teacher Appreciation Week. You can see it says thank you. And he wrote in it, sure, we had quite a few disagreements in the past. You have truly taught me plenty, and I hope you can forgive me. That's what he said. But I have noticed that your markers weren't. I have noticed that your markers were down, so it's easy to guess what I got you. So, along with this card, he got me a black dry erase marker because I completely ran out of dry erase markers. So that was another gift he gave me. And really the best part of this card is in the corner. If you can see his name. Do you see it says Fernando?
Yeah.
You see how he circled FE and he put iron there?
Yeah.
That is like a golden moment for a science teacher, where the student puts a block around their letters and sees an element in it. So that was something else. So Fernando, thank you very much. Shouting you out. You made my day. Teacher Appreciation Week. That means we also have to appreciate Jake, who's also a teacher, and Eduardo, who's a teacher as well. And of course, I'm going to appreciate Kenny because Kenny is teaching a very important person right now.
Yeah, my baby.
All right. Well, those middle schoolers can now log out if they wish to. Right. And why don't you introduce today's topic, since we have our Jake visiting today, and he is going to be sharing with us a topic that you decided you should share.
Jake's going to say more about it, but one thing I want to say is, what this episode's happening because Jake actually said, "Hey," Jake called me and said, "Hey, can I come on to What's Left and talk about this stuff?" He's going to go to Moldova and give a presentation on some of the stuff he's talking about, and he's just like, I'd like to kind of share it with you and possibly share with our audience and just kind of workshop it a little bit. And I was like, yes, let's do that. So I'm not going to try to say what Jake's talking about. He's going to tell you what he's talking about. But what I was most excited about, Jake, is you considering us for doing this. Like, it's an honor. I think your work is very important. I think you do amazing research. And I think you're incredibly diligent and honest. So the fact that you come to us to talk about this, that's an honor. So I appreciate it.
Oh, well, I appreciate it. I know how much you liked for me to come here and test out all my half-baked research before I've ironed it out completely. So I wanted to give you the gift of that today.
Exactly. Thank you.
Yeah. Can you maybe say something about the Moldova trip? Like, how is what you're going to share today? What are you doing in Moldova?
So I'm speaking at, it's called Chisinau Forum. I was invited by the former deputy prime minister, and his name's Yuri Roszka. I met him in Poland when I went, and I did a presentation in Poland at Jagiellonian University last year. And so the topic that he had for the forum, the conference, is revolving around unrestricted warfare. So different methods of warfare in basically this fourth industrial revolution. So psychological warfare, economic warfare, etc. And so basically what I wanted to look at was basically dual use, ed tech as dual use technology. So dual use is a euphemism for it can be used for both civilian and military purposes. And I stumbled onto that angle based on some of the research that I put together and spoke about when I went to Tulsa. I did a podcast with Courtney Turner on the Courtney Turner podcast. She was doing some activist stuff, trying to block some of the school choice bills in Tennessee. So I dug through a bunch of Charlotte's old Charlotte Iserbyt's files, and she had a bunch of stuff on school choice. So I want to just provide a historical breakdown of the school choice movement. And I stumbled onto a bunch of stuff involving the Rand Corporation. And that led me to a network of other institutions involved in future forecasting and a bunch of other jargon terminology that we'll walk through rather than me just throw it out there. But what I basically found was behind a lot of the school choice, the public-private partnership infrastructure, and the ed tech infrastructure was essentially a sort of a military intelligence program.
No, I was just thinking that school choice has been around for many years, even though I'm relatively young. I remember Race to the Top was part of it, right? With Obama. Am I right? I'm asking you.
Oh yeah, school. I mean, so the Race to the Top. I don't know that necessarily in and of itself was a school choice initiative. I think Race to the Top basically replaced No Child Left Behind, so it had to do with the standardized testing. But Obama for sure did push the charter school movement, the school choice movement. It took picked up a lot of steam under him. I mean, his Secretary of Education was Arnie Duncan. Arnie Duncan basically, he was huge in the privatization of the Chicago public school system when he was CEO of CPS. So, yeah, I mean, the charter school choice movement definitely picked up steam during the Obama years, continued through the Trump years, but it goes back further than that as well. Yeah.
And I would say that and I want to get to your topic, but I would say that the Race to the Top really was another step forward in the standardization of education, and really the implementation of the integration of ed tech in Silicon Valley more deeply into education, which took another step forward in the COVID period. So it's, as I look at it, is all part of the process of automating education.
Yeah, well, so in one of the other ways that the school choice movement facilitates that is through the virtual charter school industry, right? It's basically, it was the first time that we had online platforms through which entire curriculums were delivered. This kind of got the foot in the door for LMS systems in brick and mortar schools, and then now we're sort of in this in between phase that are so you could call it hybrid, but even if you're not hybrid, I don't know how they do it where you're at, but I've noticed that there's no such thing as a snow day anymore, right? You log in at home, you know what I mean? So it's that online component is embedded even into as sort of a safety feature of even the brick and mortar traditional schools at this point.
What I think the process is more, it is slow building of infrastructure within that. This brick and mortar is going to be an exoskeleton, which is ultimately going to be shed and replaced with an all online. And ultimately, I think brick and mortar schools will be gone. Everyone's going to be at your home. You're going to be at your own home, and you're going to be part of an education connection to the internet from cradle to grave. So that education will be a constant part of your life, and it's really going to be retraining as you search for jobs in a gig economy where it's hard to, or your jobs are hard to come by, as AI takes more of that space up.
And you're talking more about K through 12, right? Like college is not involved in this conversation.
Well, what I really want to do is I want to look at the macro, and then I'm going to zoom in and look at the micro in terms of the public-private K through 12 infrastructure. All right, but these systems that we're going to look at, you're going to see are ubiquitous. Basically, the cybernetics, right? This has always been sort of my thesis, right, in the book, was that as you start to integrate through like the wraparound services, the healthcare and the community policing and the workforce training, as you synthesize those or integrate those into the schooling infrastructure, right? The two sort of become one, right? They become it becomes a unified sort of system, right? And so the AI, the track and trace technologies, right, from one industry to the other are really part of an overarching network, right? But so what I'm going to do is we're going to look at, right, it's just sort of the overarching. I want to look at the history of computer modeling, right? So like systems dynamics and group dynamics. Then I want to look at various planning strategies, many of which come out of RAND Corporation. So scenario planning, planning, programming, budgeting systems, action research. Okay. So these have to do with how they use the models to plan, right? Centrally plan the economy and all the various sectors, right? Healthcare, education, et cetera. Then I want to look at how the plans are based on futurist forecasting, right? So we'll look at the futurist movement, how it overlaps with the New Age movement, and how they sort of set the parameters for the scenario planning, the PPBS, based on the computer models. Then we'll zoom in and see what that looks like in K through 12, like the public-private partnerships, the school choice, community schooling, et cetera. Then I want to zoom out and sort of look at how the military intelligence, something called network-centric warfare, is part of the infrastructure. And then if we have time, I'll sort of break down the ways in which psychological conditioning techniques are used, right? So we'll break down sort of a myriad or a constellation of humanistic stimulus response, group psychology, and gestalt psychology, and how that all fits into these models. I know it sounds like a lot, but I think it can do this in a way that it actually is pretty clear, right?
Well, let's get started.
All right, let's get started.
Eduardo, did you have any questions? Sorry, I think we interrupted you earlier.
No, I'd like to know how far down we go, but let's let Jake then map how far down we go. Do we go down to elementary school, which is where I'm at.
I think that'll be germane. I think that will be germane to where we go. So I'm just going to start off with give you a visual of like I drew a lot of charts with different pieces at the middle, right? So I laid out 6 things, right? 6 topics here for this presentation. And I've got a model or graph for each one of those. Okay. And so I'll at least have a visual representation. And then if I break them down into pieces, I think you'll be able to follow it. So this is kind of the overarching. You can't see the whole thing at the same time.
No.
But here's kind of here's like the school stuff on the bottom. But where we're going to start is kind of at the macro here. So really right now, I mean, we don't have to break all this down right now, but we'll touch on all this at some point, is sort of this model here. So you see SD in these little circles, and you see GD in these different circles, and then you see SS. Okay. So that's systems dynamics, group dynamics, and then this is systems of systems, right? In other words, it integrates basically an aggregate of all these different systems. Okay. So the systems dynamics, right? These have to do with what they call complex, non-linear systems, all right? And they're basically mathematical computer models for managing those various systems. So what I sort of broke these down into the different sectors, right? So systems dynamics they started the research based on like supply chains and things like that. And then actually one of the most prominent, one of the most well-known systems dynamics models was the limits to growth models for the overpopulation, environment, all that stuff. Okay. But so what I have here is, right, basically systems dynamics for education, healthcare, right, sustainable development, stakeholder capitalism, security. Okay. So in other words, cyber or national security. All right. So you have these different systems that sort of make up the broader political economy. And then you have, right, the different groups of people that fit into these different dynamics, right? And so you break these down into all of the sort of the intersectional identity categories: your race, class, gender, sexual identity, religion, political identity, right? And each of those sort of has its own group dynamic. Okay. And so the systems dynamics are based on the group dynamics, right? And if you have a computer system, a system of systems that tracks all of it, right, through cybernetics, you could control that largely, eventually through, right, military intelligence operations. And so here, if this is the education, right, this would be sort of the whole school choice thing would just be one of these systems in this broader aggregate. Okay, so this is like the model of what we're looking at. All right, so now what I want to look at is, well, let me pause. Let me just go ahead and let you guys questions or anything. Maybe I'll switch here and
not much so far. Although I think in that systems of systems, like would protein folding and those kind of problems in biology be the kinds of things that would be involved in there as well? Like basically taking a DNA sequence that gets an amino acid sequence, and from that amino acid sequence, figuring how the protein folds three-dimensionally. Is that one of those things that would be in one of those iterative systems?
Well, systems dynamics has been used for modeling, right, biological systems, right? Yeah. In the way that I conceived of this model, that would be a system inside the individual inside the group dynamic.
Yeah.
Right. But there is models for, like you said, like, metabolism and things like that largely involve the same metrics. Right. And so one of the things that, this is a nice segue actually. Okay. So let's go, maybe I'll share my screen.
So what you just showed us, Jake, is you just setting up a structure, like you came up with this, right? With these connections, or did you get it from, you came up with how these things connect, right? Okay.
Yes. Yeah.
This is your model.
Yeah. I graphed that. That's my model. So we start with the Macy Cybernetics conferences. So if you want a nice breakdown of it, there's a good documentary by Aaron Dykes and Melissa Dykes. It's called The Minds of Men. Excellent documentary. It looks at the history of the Macy Cybernetics conferences and the way that it overlapped with MK Ultra and the establishment of the World Mental Health Federation. And basically what it was between 1946 and 1953, had a series of conferences that were funded and put on by the Josiah Macy Jr. Foundation. And it turns out that the Josiah Macy Jr. Foundation was funded by the CIA, or came up in certain CIA records. And so basically it was a shell company or a shell foundation that was used to channel CIA funds. And this would have been for some of its research into behavioral control, which I would guess probably overlapped or dovetailed with some of the MK Ultra or the artichoke stuff. Okay.
Is this Macy related to the department store?
I'm pretty sure that it's the same family. I'm almost positive. But the two people that put it on were sort of in charge of organizing it were Lawrence K. Frank and Frank Fremont Smith. All right. When the person that's of most important for what we're going to talk about today is Kurt Lewin. Okay. But people like Norbert Wiener and John von Neumann, these are like sort of the founding fathers of modern cybernetics, in the way that Alan Turing is sort of the founding father of modern artificial intelligence. It's sort of the theories of Turing and Wiener and von Neumann that basically give us sort of the bedrock theories that we're going to break down into sort of into the various computer models. Okay. So prior to the Macy Cybernetics Conference, there was like a precursor to it. I don't have it mapped on here, but it was called, I believe it was called the Conference on Cerebral Inhibition. And the two mechanisms they focused on was basically what they called hypnosis and the conditioned reflex. All right. So basically the subconscious and the conscious, right? So the behaviorist school and basically the psychoanalytic school. All right. And so there's people like von Neumann and Wiener that basically figured out sort of the feedback loop or algorithm, the mathematics that graph how the human mind and the human nervous system mirrors a computer. Right. And it has to do with continuous feedback. It relates to one of Lewin's theories on what we're going to see in a second called action research. So it's this process by which I believe it goes, what are the steps? It's plan, act, observe, reflect. Right. So like, in something as simple as I'm going to grab, I want to adjust this microphone, right? Like my brain, from the time I take my hand where it's at and I move it to here, there's a continuous, right, monitoring feedback loop that, right, I'm getting closer, I'm on it, I'm grabbing it, not too hard, not too, right. You don't want to grab it too tight. You want to grab it too soft, right? This is all the brain is, right, with each frame, I guess, right? With each neuronal movement closer, right? There's a feedback telling me, right, that I'm getting closer to the objective. Okay. And this is how this gets back to what you're saying, Andy, about what you're asking about, right? How you could model biological systems, right? You could do this using the same types of algorithms you would use for some of the EEG feedback or the EKG feedback. Okay. But you can do the same thing with like production, consumption, supply chain feedback loops, right? Things like that. So Lewin came up with a theory on how to model basically group psychology. And he came up with a theory called group dynamics. All right. And it's based largely on Gestalt psychology. So the idea is that, so we've heard me talk about the stimulus response behaviorism on this channel quite a bit, right? And we usually talk about it like, right, one-to-one, sort of the individual student to the learning stimuli on the adaptive learning screen, right? Well, according to Lewin, right, the environmental stimuli that are most powerful, that have the most conditioning the efficacy, are those that are ingrained basically in group dynamics. And it has to do with sort of, right, the reinforcements, the punishments and rewards that are built in the group dynamics. And that there's a certain that the group, right, if you were to model it quantitatively, right, as an algorithm, it would have a certain gestalt. Right? So this is where like the idea of Gestalt school of psychology, it's largely a perceptual school, and it focuses heavily on like sort of pattern association, pattern recognition, and pattern affinity in the human mind, and how we're pattern seeking in ways that, right, we look for, like, if I were to draw you, right, a circle that's, right, and then I erased parts of that circle, your mind will fill in the gaps, right? And it'll still see the circle, right? Because, right, there's something ingrained in our psychology where, right, where we seek patterns and we seek closure, right? And so there's a certain, within the gestalt of a group cohesion, right, that there's a certain reinforcement mechanism in there, and that you could shape behaviors, right? You can shape individual behaviors by messing with the group gestalt, basically, right? Like, so and we'll see how, right, in a second here, how this relates to systems dynamics, right? Because, right, you could probably infer here then, right, if we can alter the group, then we can alter the system, right? So, so he set up the research center on group dynamics. Out of group dynamics comes, right, there's different ways that those group gestalts are sort of graphed, right? So you have your intergroup dynamics, your intra-group dynamics, and then an aggregate of both, basically like what we might call intersectional group dynamics. And this is where we get into, right, all things what we call nowadays woke, right? The whole blend of what is sometimes called the cultural Marxist identity politics that comes out of critical theory, right? But right, so you basically have dialectics between, right, an intragroup representation of all those, right, those models I had: race, class, gender, sexuality, religious identity, political identity, okay, and then the ways in which those groups, right, interact, okay, and all of this we can graph this, but you can create group cohesion through various what they'll call group therapies that come out that were sort of piloted it's called the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations. Kurt Lewin is known as a shadow founder of that institution. He was close friends with one of the direct founders, and that was Eric Trist. But what comes out of it is this thing called T groups, and I don't have it graphed here, but T groups are similar to something that is used in the human potential movement called encounter groups. Sometimes, businesses like to do these when you go on these retreats, right? And you do these breakout sessions, right? But it's this idea where, right, you're trying to get everybody on board with, we'll use the business dynamics as a particular, as a sort of a case study, that, right, the idea here is to get all of the different breakout groups on board with what the CEO or whatever has in store for the agenda, basically, right? And so this has to do with, right, how you can create new group affinities by playing with the gestalt of group cohesion and group conflict or group dialectic, right? And this is where you get stuff like that he came up with. Yeah, here it is: sensitivity training. And then this relates to other sorts of what they might sometimes they call conflict resolution training. But there's essentially, it's a strategy of group therapy that's meant to break down what Charlotte called the resistors, right? The resistors to what is often called the change agent agenda, at least in education. Right. So I'm going to pause before I keep going. But right. So basically what I've laid out right now is, right, I'm just trying to explain to you what are group dynamics, like what's the psychology involved, and basically trying to explain ways that you can model it mathematically on a computer. Right. So I'm going to shut up and let y'all jump in.
I think so far the only thing maybe I would have a question about is, I don't really see what's the difference between, so intra-group dynamics is you have a group, how do they interact within that group? Intergroup dynamics seem to me is how do the different groups interact with each other? I don't see a difference between intergroup dynamics and intersectional, because politically intersectionality was about how the different oppressions or the oppressed groups might interact. And so I don't see a difference between intergroup and intersectional, I guess. Do you see one?
Well, maybe if you just look at, if you look at it, right, I have intergroup is connected to intersectional, but not inter. And intragroup is connected to intersectional, but not inter. Intersectional is connected to both, meaning, right, in terms of mathematical modeling, right, if you want to get signals, you want to have one model where you're just looking at the intragroup dynamics. You want one where you're just looking at the intergroup dynamics, and then you want to take all those models and you want to lay them on top of each other, and you get a different gestalt, and that's what I would call the intersectional group dynamics, right? So that's, maybe that's semantic, but I sort of graphed it, or I mapped it considering, right, how how it would work together in terms of modeling, right? And
Yep.
from smaller groups to larger groups into the systems, and then the system of systems. Yeah. So you see, that I have it connected to system dynamics, scenario planning. We'll get into action research in a second, but this is all Kurt Lewin's ideas, right? Remember, he comes out of this Macy Cybernetics conferences. So the original Research Center for Group Dynamics was set up at Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Okay. Now, I couldn't actually find whether or not it was located within the Sloan Business School at MIT, but its since has been moved to the University of Michigan Institute for Social Research. Okay. And well, I don't want to digress, but that might come back up again. If we look at Lewin's connections to some of the people at the Frankfurt School, which was also called the Frankfurt Institute for Social Research, which is where you get the cultural critical theory, which is where you get what has been colloquially termed cultural Marxism, right? And so, in other words, all that the intersectional identity politics, right, comes out of that Frankfurt School, and Lewin was connected to some of those folks there. Well, in particular, we'll just note Karl Korsch would have been one of them, and he was actually a member of the Communist Party of Germany. Okay, but the reason I point out MIT here is that if we go to MIT and we go to the Sloan School of Management, we'll see that who do we have here is J.W. Forrester, and J.W. Forrester is the guy who came up with system dynamics. So J.W. Forrester is important because he comes up with this concept of system dynamics. Okay. And some of the systems dynamics models that he came up with had to do with, like I said, early stuff with supply chain and stuff like that. I think it was, GE worked with General Electric. Okay. And did some system dynamics modeling for them and their supply chain stuff. What he's probably most famous for, though, is, right, he did these computer models for the limits to growth. So basically, he uses systems dynamics models to basically predict, sort of the ratio of resource production, consumption to population growth, et cetera, to predict when would be the Malthusian catastrophe, and what did we need to do to, recalibrate the system so that it doesn't basically take us into the Malthusian catastrophe, right? And this was based on his system dynamics models. Okay. And he made a similar sort of Malthusian predictions in this World One computer program, as well as another system dynamic model. But go ahead. You were going to say something?
Yeah. Jake, one question I have: when is he doing this work?
Oh, thank you. I should have said that. So Macy Cybernetics conferences are from 1946 to 1953. Kurt Lewin comes up with group dynamics. Well, the Research Center for Group Dynamics was founded in 1945. I think he came up with the theory, shortly before that, a couple of years, maybe most. J.W. Forrester, he comes up with system dynamics. He comes up with that in 1956. Okay, and then limits to growth, right? The models that he used for what become, the modern sustainable development metrics, basically. That would have been 1971, right? So they'd had some practice with system dynamics, largely focused again, like supply chain industry and stuff like that. And then in the 70s, they've with the rise of the environmental movement, they started using their computer modeling for predicting like the global Malthusian holding capacity, etc. I paused because I thought maybe there was a follow up to your.
No, that's just want to get the time frame on it.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, maybe did he have a prediction like Malthusian? The Malthusian prediction is like basically a depopulation event that occurs because there are too many people, not enough resources, mass starvation, it would generally be the idea that people are going to die on a mass level. Did he have a prediction about when that was going to happen and what it might look like?
Oh, I had one. There was this Big Think article. Is it in here? Hold on. Here, hold on. Yeah, I think this is it here. 1973, an MIT computer predicted when civilization will end. Okay.
2040.
Yeah, 2040. There you go.
All right.
And I think just hold on. Yeah, and then 2020 pops up in here. In fact, 2020 is the first milestone envisioned by World One. That's when the quality of life is supposed to drop dramatically. The broadcast presented this scenario and how it would lead to the demise of large numbers of people. Make it bigger so people can see it. At around 2020, the condition of the planet becomes highly critical. If we do nothing about it, the quality of life goes down to zero. Pollution becomes so seriously, it will. That's a typo. So pollution becomes so serious, it will start to kill people, which in turn will cause the population to diminish lower than it was in the 1900s, probably supposed to be hundreds. At this stage, around 2040 to 2050, civilized life as we know it on the planet will cease to exist. And this is, by the way, Alexander King. He's the leader of the Club of Rome. The Club of Rome is so the MIT team on the predicament of mankind ran those computer programs, but they did it in partnership with the Club of Rome. Okay, so based on the models, they wrote the Limits to Growth book, which is based on the MIT models, and then the Club of Rome actually is the publisher of that text. Okay, and so then it says Alexander King, the then leader of the Club of Rome, evaluated the program's result to also mean that nation states will lose their sovereignty, forecasting a new world order with corporations managing everything. So
this might be I don't know if I'm getting myself ahead. I recently watched this thing about Henry Kissinger and how at around this time, like he also becomes sort of like a early proponent of the climate change narrative. And I don't know if there's any link here about that, or if you.
Well, let me just look real quick. Let me just see what happens when I put in Kissinger.
Because at least in what I saw, they argue, again, the term Malthusian ideas come up, when it comes to climate change and linking it to, world catastrophe that needs to be managed, and
Okay, well, so now, right, I'm thinking like, as far as climate change in particular, I never it's not in my map, okay, but this right here, National Security Memorandum 200 is essentially a Malthusian document, right? This is where they're talking about basically overpopulation capacity, and they posited different methods to curtail population growth. And then he would have been right in the Nixon administration. And during the Nixon administration, right, that's when the EPA was created. So this is right. That's when the 70s. So that's right when, right, 1971 is Limits to Growth. It's also the year that the United Nations Environmental Program was created. But I think it was 70, or it might have even been 71. It's either 70 or 71 that we came up with our own EPA, and that was done by Nixon. And Nixon also, right, he made this U.S. Commission on Population Growth in the American Future, another Malthusian document. And the report here, so this was sponsored by John D. Rockefeller III, right? And if we follow that family back a couple generations, right, we get to their financing of Nazi eugenics, etc. But also involved in this paper is on population is Bernard Berelson, and he was also an official at the Population Council, another Malthusian nonprofit. So he definitely was involved and in the orbit of depopulation initiatives in the 70s, right? So I don't know that, again, like climate change, I don't know that was the buzzword at that time, right? But it's all part of the same historical development.
Definitely in the 70s, the population bomb threat, people, that came out, the idea that population would grow so big that the human organism would die if it's not managed, because people were having, essentially, people and generally people in the colonized countries were having too many kids.
Right. And the emphasis, right, was the tenor was much more explicitly Malthusian in the 70s. In the 90s, there was I think they call it the Cairo Consensus, but there was an international conference on population and development held by the United Nations. And, a lot of the, so-called third world countries kind of got tired of a lot of the forcible sterilization programs that were big in the 70s, the 60s, 70s, and might even went into the 80s, the China one child policy and all that. But at the Cairo conference, they basically, there was a draft to remove any Malthusian coercive initiatives into the larger population program of the United Nations. But they obviously still endorsed what they call voluntary, population reduction. So basically, instead of forcibly sterilizing people, they just wanted to provide what they called more access to the women's healthcare services, right? But again, so in the 70s, right, it was a lot more emphasis was the environmental emphasis. There was a much more explicit Malthusian rhetoric, and then as we sort of move, into the successive decades, you get more of an emphasis on climate change, global warming, these phrases, and the Malthusian thing. They sort of they try to repackage it under what they called access to women's rights. So basically, right, they thought that if they could go to these countries where they had a traditional family dynamic and the woman, right, more or less lived at home and basically had babies and was domestic, that if you could get her into the workforce, she would then therefore want to delay getting married and having kids so that she could finish her career and make more money. And then in the meantime, if you added the healthcare services, right, she could also prevent any unwanted or accidental pregnancies, and that this would be a more efficient and more effective system than a coercive top-down means of regulating birth control, particularly in the third world where they have, the traditional lifestyles where there's but agrarian communities where large families are often valued in ways that they're not in industrial societies, basically. So,
and wouldn't you say that these experiments in social control and social engineering were also facilitated by like IMF, World Bank, where conditions of allowing countries, the squads of NGOs to come in to your country were connected to the possibility of having money and getting investment money and things like that.
Oh yeah, 100%, right. And this is where we're so now sort of steer us back, right. If we're thinking about global system dynamics in terms of environmental resource stability, right, sort of extraction and consumption of natural resources on a global scale. You mentioned the role of NGOs, the international governance organizations, multinational corporations and foundations, et cetera. Now you're getting a glimpse of how the public-private partnership industry, right, the so-called stakeholder capitalist infrastructure, are basically the leverage points for which you can manipulate the models through whatever food programs or so-called healthcare programs or whatever to reach the goal of the model, right, and to track it as you do it, right. And so nice segue. So thus comes along something called action research. All right, so Kurt Lewin came up with this concept of action research, right? So based on your systems dynamics and your group dynamic models, you engage in a system of or a process of planning, acting, observing, and then reflecting. Okay, and then you loop back to the plan, right? Because with the new observations and the new reflections comes a new plan and a new action. Right. And it's refined. And those things which worked effectively are reinforced and done again. Those things which did not work effectively, right, those are jettisoned and those are refined. Okay. So what you end up having is what's called also scenario planning. So you're not just planning for, right, I mean, you have an ideal outcome, but then you realize there's a range of possible outcomes. All right. And if through the action research, you get the feedback loop and you can track some of these scenarios. We'll look at a couple, but some of these scenario planning models, they're often broken down into 4 quadrants, right? And it's been on an axis of either, strong to weak and fast to slow, and right, different metrics on this quadrant. And so, right, you'll have an ideal quadrant that you want to reach. That's the outcome you want to get to. And you're tracking, right, as you engage in the action research, you're tracking, are we on course to reach the desired quadrant, or are we veering into one of the others? And what adjustments can we make based on the data that we have to ensure that we reach the quadrant that we want to reach? So it involves actually involves a combination of both linear planning. So that would be the planning, programming, and budgeting systems. And then the nonlinear planning, that's the scenario planning. All right. So I've talked about planning, programming, and budgeting systems several times in the past. Both of these concepts come out of the Rand Corporation. Scenario planning in particular was conceived of by Herman Kahn, who himself is a futurist, member of the World Future Society. I think I mentioned him when I was on the show a while back there. But the PPBS, right? This is sort of the systems for central planning, was developed by the military. And then it was sort of outsourced to other agencies. And you can see on your here, right? Safe Learning Systems, Inc., U.S. Office of Education, Strategic Planning and Furthering Excellence in Information Society, Strategic Planning, and Millard Public Schools. These are both documents by Shirley McCune. She's another futurist. But these are the systems that are used to facilitate the public-private partnerships, either the community schooling wraparound services or the school choice, charter schooling, public-private partnerships, or the various voucher arrangements or the ESA savings accounts arrangements, right? That determine how the public funds get to be distributed to the private schools and how they work together in a network, a public-private planned economic network. And so this is linear in the sense of like, right? Remember like the old, like kind of the 5-year plans that the Soviet Union would have, right? Like, you sort of have an objective, you kind of look at your resources and, your options, and you execute that, right? And then in a 5-year, and then at the end of the 5 years, you sort of go back to the drawing board and make some adjustments, right? But, so that's sort of the planning part in the first step of the action research. Right. But sort of within the feedback loop is where you can use the linear PPBS and you can adjust it in real time to achieve the non-linear goals in the scenario planning. All right. And so I can show you some examples of scenario planning and look at some of the history behind it, some of the institutions that are involved in it. But I want to pause so y'all can ask questions or whatever you need to do.
I think what I'll try to do is just summarize what I've heard here. Is what you're describing is trying to integrate a linear plan, like the 5-year kind of plan that is talked about in the former Soviet Union, or even what is currently happening in China. So at least that's the way it's characterized. When the party controls the economy and controls everything, and just makes a plan and acts on it in these various meetings that they have of the CCP. But here they're trying to integrate that linear plan with a sort of non-linear and more almost like chaotic things that seem less predictable, but trying to integrate those into a plan of control, a plan of, we want to get here. How do we get everything there? Not just how do we plan there. That's how I'm hearing it.
Yeah, exactly. Like, because if you think about, right, action research, right, action to execute is to be linear, right? At the moment of execution, right? Like I think about if I'm sparring, right? When you're sort of, right, squaring up and you're changing angles, right? And you're moving your head and you're moving your hips and you're moving your feet, right? You're changing the distance, you're changing the angle, right? I'm looking at all these variables and all these possibilities, all these scenarios, right? But the moment I take action, the moment I decide to act on one of those openings, right? At this point, right, I've committed to momentarily a linear action, right, which is gonna bring about a response and then an adjustment, right? So it's basically the action layer of the action research, right, is sort of the execution of a linear PPBS program, right? And then as that's executed, you get a feedback loop through the observation and reflection, the data tracking, and then that tells you whether or not your linear trajectory is actually moving towards which of the 4 scenarios it's moving towards in that moment, basically. And so the scenario planning comes.
Last thing, sorry, Jake. Last thing, I don't want to get ahead too much. I can already imagine that when we talk about data collection now today, we need to understand data collection isn't just about advertising. We have to understand data collection through the lens of this process. That it is, and that data collection and obviously AI and things like that are bringing much more information and more measurable things to assess how these things interact, and then make potentially better plans for how to make the world look the way you want it to make it look. Is that what I'm getting at here?
Yeah. So rather than looking at data tracking in terms of like behavioral advertising for just a purely for profit motivation, sort of on a just a consumer to corporation dynamic, right, just for a profit incentive, is missing. That it's not, the end game is not just to be able to sell you more stuff more efficiently, right, through predictive analytics. The end game is to be able to shape your behaviors to make you buy things you don't want to buy, right? But that's just on the individual scale. Now you have to sort of zoom out and think about it in terms of, it's 1,000% to psychologically re-engineer the person's value systems, their desires, right? Forget their behaviors, right? Like and not just on an individual basis, but on a group scale and at a systems level, right? Like at a regional level, at a national level, at a global level, at an institutional scale, right? At the scale of, right, the various sectors of the global economy, right? And so, and the end game then is to shape the behaviors towards the end game of what they call the homeostasis, right? And you've probably heard Allison talk about this, but it's this concept of when all of the parts of the system are working together in some kind of an equilibrium, right? And this would be, might not want to go there yet, because this is where we get into some more of the philosophy behind that drives the forecasting, and it's deeply rooted in futurism and in the new age, and essentially the occult, and so it's the economic dimensions of it are basically just the drivers or the inputs and the outputs. So they're the things that make the energy flow right into the direction that they want it to flow in, right? That the financial, the corporate, the commercial, that these are sort of the punishment and rewards, the incentives that manipulate the behaviors individually and on a group level to conform with the homeostasis of the systems dynamics that they've created for the 4th Industrial Revolution, right? So I mean, it's the end game is the transmutation of the mind and human behavior. Like, that's the product,
right? And to change the groups themselves in order to then change the individual. So it's not just about getting information and observing the individual. You are attempting to observe and alter them and alter the groups that they are interacting with. It is individual and social engineering.
Yeah, I mean, the more I dug into this, and like I looked at the timing of the Macy Cybernetics Conference and then the MK Ultra experiments. People think about the MK Ultra stuff, the CIA is basically, surreptitiously dosing people with LSD and doing all kinds of these weird, secretive, clandestine, experiments, pretty much illegal, right? Like that level of black ops stuff. And you think like that's what mind control is. No. One of the things that was mentioned in one of the documents in the documentary, the Minds of Men, documentary. They were reading some of the documents from the proceedings of the cybernetics conferences, and they said something to the effect of that, whether pharmacological or psychological methods of conditioning, neither is very effective on an individual scale, at an individual level for a long period of time. All of the various principles they discovered for manipulating thoughts and behaviors, if you want those to be most effective, it has to be done in a group setting and thus reinforced by the larger group, not just the group being like the human beings around you, but right, the way that the groups are reified through the culture being the symbols of the institutions and the propaganda, the media that we consume, right? All of that needs to reinforce, right, the whatever is the messaging that you're seeking to reprogram the individual with. So what I'm saying is that like the stuff MK Ultra is like, oh yeah, and then we stopped that. Well, no, they just took it and started to apply it to, broadcast media, you know what I mean? Social media, education system, right? Like they figured out, all they were doing was figuring out the mechanisms of neurology, brain science, right? The stimulus response mechanism, how environments and groups, right? And aggregate all these different schools of psychology into this systems dynamics and group dynamics. That is the fruits of not just your Macy cybernetics conferences, but the ways that overlaps with your MK Ultra experiments. Should I keep going or should I? Or
can I make a comment?
Yeah.
When you mentioned the LSD, mind control program in the CIA, that reminded me of a time when even the U.S. government was trying to, and there's a book about it. I just found the book. I was trying to figure out, and it's written by Annie Jacobson, and it's called Phenomenon, and it's a secret history of the U.S. government's investigation into extrasensory perception and psychokinesis, which it was about the intelligence community trying to have secret program to try to control people's minds with what do you call it?
Psychotropics? Psychedelics? Psychotropics?
No, not just psychedelics. It was psychics with
psychotronics. Oh, yeah.
And so I just remembered that, and as you were mentioning, it's like, how long has the USA been on this mission to try to weaponize people with mind control, and then later on, it didn't work, even though they tried for decades hiring people that they thought had real magic or something, and it was a government experiment, and then eventually they went on with psychologists or parallel to psychologists. And this has always been the game of the government to try to have, under the name or the guise of trying to figure out what Russian intelligence is doing or whatever, trying to really dominate and manipulate people's minds and the population.
Yeah, well, that's a nice segue, actually, believe it or not, because so scenario planning was, again, started by Herman Kahn. He's a big shot at the Rand Corporation. And one of the first places that it was actually sort of tested out, right, or proven, right, where its mettle was proven, was at Royal Dutch Shell. And that was done by this guy by the name of, I'm like, where's he at? Here he is, Peter Schwartz. All right. Now he's, right, Association of Professional Futurists. And he's part of this thing called the Global Business Network. Well, the Global Business Network is a scenario planning institution, right? And we're going to dive into that. But to the segue, right, based on what you just said, the connection here is another institution that's known for scenario planning is, Stanford. It used to be Stanford Research Institute, and then they changed it to SRI International. And so I have them both here. It's pretty much the same institution. Okay. So if I go to SRI International, Stargate Project, and this was one of these projects that they had that was where they were looking into, I believe it was remote viewing. It was some kind of extrasensory perception technique for military purposes. And this was a partnership between SRI, the Defense Intelligence Agency, the Central Intelligence Agency. Oh, and this company Well, this is interesting. That's right. So this is Science Applications International Corporation. All right. It's then it became Leidos or Leidos. I'm not sure how you say it. It's a defense contractor that's connected to Lockheed Martin. But one of the presidents of this company was a guy by the name of William Owen. William Owen is the guy that came up with System of Systems, right? And this is the computer networking cybernetic system that ties together all of your modeling for both systems dynamics and group dynamics, right? Aggregates them together. And this was part of something called Revolution in Military Affairs. This occurred in the 70s and 80s. And then there was different iterations. One of them would have been Systems of Systems, and that's related to what's called network-centric warfare. I'm getting ahead here. I didn't mean to go that direction, but I did the segue and then it looped us back here. We'll talk about this guy in some depth. You can see he's an important dude. He's got his hands in all kind of stuff. But I need to go back to the scenario planning. So a couple other institutions that are important here are the Wharton Business School. Okay. And if you didn't know, that's where Donald Trump went. Mm-hmm. All right. Now, just saying, remember the last show that we were talking about the Trump presidency, and we were kind of exploring the idea of whether or not he came from out of nowhere, or whether or not he was planned to show up on the scene to make the slam dunk for the 20 or 30-year program or whatever. Well, he comes out of a school where they do scenario planning, and scenario planning is done, right? 5, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50-year plans. These are sort of benchmarks for recalibration on the nonlinear scenario planning feedback loop. All right. So I'm just saying, right? We noted all these other reasons why it's likely that, he didn't come from out of nowhere. Well, he comes from an institution that does, long-term planning. And so, he knows about long-term planning. And anyways, you get where I'm going with this. All right. But we're going to talk about Hudson Institute because, look, you can see here that's Herman Kahn set that up. All right. And it's known for future studies. The important one here, though, is right now is the Global Business Network. Global Business Network is set up by that guy, Peter Schwartz. Schwartz is an interesting guy, though, because not just that he's right and helped found the Global Business Network, but okay, he's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. He's a member of the World Economic Forum. He was a director at SRI. Okay, so right back at Stanford Research Institution, Strategic Environment Center. So right, some kind of sustainable development planning, I'm guessing. But look here, the Berggruen Institute. Never heard of it until I was doing this research. Look at the people on the Berggruen Institute 21st Century Council. So he's on there. I mean, you got a lot of who's who here.
Elon Musk, Eric Schmidt, Jack Dorsey, Francis Fukuyama, Lawrence Summers, Nicholas Sarkozy.
Yeah.
A lot of recognized names here.
Yeah.
Joseph Stiglitz was the winner of the economics Nobel Prize, the Prize for Economics.
Yeah, one of those guys that was actually he was vocal against a lot of the ways the World Bank was doing some of that predatory lending, but I don't think if we look closer to some of his solutions, I don't know that we like them.
He wrote
yeah.
He wrote the book, I think it was Globalization and Its Discontents.
Yeah. Right. And then look at this. Look, Fukuyama, did you know he was currently a trustee at the Rand Corporation? Right? He's a guy at the end of history, right? Really famous in academia. Right. These two guys are interesting. I helped my friend Michael Rechtenwald did a presentation for the AFA on China, and I helped him with some of the research on that. And these two came up. Okay. So Zhu Min, this guy is deputy governor of the People's Bank of China, group VP of the Bank of China, IMF managing director. Now he's a trustee at Princeton. I don't know what his role is at Johns Hopkins. Can't remember. Trustee of the World Economic Forum, officer at the World Bank. Okay. And then Fred Hu, another Chinese national with a lot of Western Anglo-American roundtable connections. So this is basically securities and futures at Hong Kong. Ant Financial, that's the company that runs Alibaba, right? And then that's the company that runs that social credit system, Sesame Credit. Goldman Sachs, okay, IMF, Was he CFR? I'm pretty sure. Yeah, there he is. She's CFR Global Board of Advisors. Okay. But this is interesting to show you sort of, again, not just the important people that are connected to this Peter Schwartz guy, but also to show you these cross-regional globalist alliances. So it just shows you, more global coordination. Now, I want to show you this GBN. This thing's important here because of these two scenario projects. All right. Well, real quick, before I get into the look at these scenario planning, just a couple connections I want you to know here. This is important. Global Business Network. Look who is worked at the Global Business. This is Mary Catherine Bateson. She's the daughter of Gregory Bateson and Margaret Mead. Both of them are attended the Macy's Cybernetics conferences. Okay. Other thing that's interesting about her sister, she's on the Human Potential Foundation and a member of the Club of Rome. All right. And then if we go back again, you'll see the Global Business Network collaborates with the Balaton Group. The Balaton Group is set up by Dennis Meadows and his wife, Danella. Dennis Meadows was one of the people that ran the systems dynamic models with J.W. Forrester that did the limits to growth predictions. Okay. So I'm just showing you that, right? This institution is also connected to historically all the stuff that we've already talked about so far, right? As far as the systems dynamic models. Okay. So in other words, scenario planning and systems dynamics, right? They go together. Okay. I mean, I'm sure I've already explicated that, but this is just more evidence, right? When you see the institutional ecosystem. Now, this one, you might have heard of this before. Scenarios for the future of technology and international development. Anybody, does that ring a bell to anybody?
Not for me.
So this document, does it look familiar now?
Oh yeah, that's the one with the lockdown.
You got it.
Yeah, the Rockefeller one.
Yeah, and look, right, Rockefeller and Global Business Network. It's the same organization. Okay. Look at the title. Now you know what the title means. Scenarios for the future of technology and international development, right? Yeah. It's scenario planning document. And look, I'm going to show you the chart. I'm going to show you the graph that they use. It's pretty much that. Remember I told you the quadrants? I'm going to show you an older document from like 90 something where it's the same graph. I'm saying that in like 30 years, they still use the quadrant vectors. This is interesting. If you zoom in here, further reading on technology, and look what we got here. The RAND Corporation, World Bank, UN Millennium Project. Okay, that's probably, I'm going to guess, right? Because the SDGs used to be the MDGs, and I'm pretty sure this is part of the precursor to the SDG Sustainable Development Agenda 2030 program, which was back then the UN MDGs Millennium Project for Agenda 21. But RAND Corporation, and then this one, Institute for the Future. We're going to look at that again today. Okay, this is another futurist planning organization, and it comes out of another person who works at the RAND Corporation, and it has ties to the RAND Corporation. Actually, I believe it. It comes directly out of institutionally. It comes out of the RAND Corporation, not just in connection with one of its personnel. So, okay, so you see these two bars here. These are the two sort of dialectical metrics that are going to make the axis for the four quadrants, right? And so these are the main things that they're sort of gaming here, right? So political and economic alignment, either strong or weak, and then adaptive capacity of the populations, right? Either low or high. And there it is. Okay, and this is where you got your four scenarios: lockstep, clever together, the hack attack, smart scramble. Now we were all pretty familiar with the lockstep scenario because that's the one that seemed to most resemble what we actually went through in 2020. It'd be interesting to look at some of these others, but I would guess too that, we never did the SPARS episode, but I would guess that if you looked at any of these, like the SPARS documents and the other pandemic simulation documents, I would guess they probably are all using a scenario planning model and probably has some sort of a vector here with perhaps different metrics being quantified on the axes. But so I'll go ahead and pause again and let y'all maybe if you want to jump in, comment, or.
I don't have anything to say about this per se, because I remember you showing this to me really years ago when the lockdowns were coming and you could see a lot of the scenarios in lockstep were the ones that were implemented. Now in this document, I remember they put it as like, we'd like to avoid this. But I was very skeptical of that reading it. It seemed as much as they were saying, we'd rather be clever together than do lockstep. I felt like they were implying that as an organization that wants to do good in the world, how do we make ourselves clever together? But at the same time, acknowledging that they may need to do lockstep if they have to, kind of thing. So it was a sell job at one level.
Yeah, like I said, I'd have to look at the other scenarios. But I'm curious. Actually, now I am curious to read some of the other scenarios. Okay, but I want to show you how this same scenario planning design is used was used for education. This is kind of how I stumbled on some of this. This is getting us close to 4 scenarios for the future of public education in Seattle. So this one was put together by the Global Business Network in collaboration with National Education Association at the state level and at the local level, right? So the Washington Education Association, Seattle Education Association. But right, so this is a Global Business Network scenario planning project compiled in collaboration with teachers unions, right? And in charge of this one in particular was Jay Ogilvy. It's interesting to note here that he actually works for Stratfor. This is like a private intelligence firm. I got Aquino there because if this goes back to one of the episodes where we talked about mind wars, this is somewhat related if we get to the net centric warfare stuff later. But he recommends Stratfor and the World Future Society as useful institutions for strategic forecasting, right? For futures forecasting, right? And for those who don't know or don't remember, Michael Aquino wrote this book called Mind War. He was lieutenant colonel. He was the head of psychological operations in the Army. He's also created this Temple of Set. He was a disciple of Anton LaVey at the Church of Satan. And at that point, we're digressing. But again, it just shows you, right? It's not just, you look at Global Business Network, you look at these businesses that do these consulting firms that do this business forecasting, but it's more than just business forecasting, right? It's also intelligence forecasting. It's also futures forecasting. And if we want to see the actual document, I have to go to these are all various institutions that are named in the document in one of the scenarios. I believe it's their ideal scenario. Paul Hill is mentioned in it in one of his projects. It has to do with school choice stuff. He's worked for the RAND Corporation. But if we go in here, Educational Excellence Coalition, this is Charlotte put this together.
And Jake, what is the time when this 4 scenarios would have been put out?
This one here, the one I'm showing you now, not the one we looked. The Rockefeller one's 2010.
Yeah. Okay. But what about the 4 scenarios for
this one? I think is 95.
Okay.
Wait, yeah, 95. I'll go ahead and open it. So this is like Charlotte typed. She used to always type in all caps for some reason. she liked exclamation points too. So this is giving her an overview on connections between the school choice movement and a lot of these futurists, and in particular, this guy, Jim Spady, comes up, and basically the whole Spady family. Now, I wasn't able to find that he actually is. This ties in with my research on Barbara Marx Hubbard that we've talked about. I couldn't find anything where they had direct communication, but they were both at the World Future Society. So was Dad, and they were on. Barbara was on a board with his dad. So I'm pretty sure that's accurate. But if we keep going down, you'll see all these attachments. Right now, we might need to cut a lot of this short, but I intended to go show you some of the connections between all these people, but these are all people pushing for this school of choice agenda, and they're all tied with this thing called the Educational Excellence Coalition. It's run by Jim and Fawn Spady. All right, and then when you get towards the end here, we're going to get to that scenario planning document. Here it is. 4 scenarios for the future of public education in Seattle. And this copy, I'm wondering how Charlotte got a copy of this. I think it was this from this woman, Dana Horde, here that I have in this other file. But this was a copy that was given to Spady. All right. And it says, Jim, this is not yet ready to go public. Therefore, consider it embargoed until further notice. Thanks, Bruce Colwell. All right. So in other words, they want this futurist guy who, if you looked at all those other documents, is all linked up with Bill Bennett and people out of the Hudson Institute, which is Herman Kahn's organization. I just pointed it out to you. It's another one of these scenario planning organizations, but it's tied to Herman Kahn and the Rand Corporation, right? And then in here, notice Global Business Network, okay? So in this ideal scenario, this is scenario 4. We call this one the change. This is the upper right out of the 4 quadrants. Right. So if we could see the model, I think this isn't the whole document. She just took excerpts. I did find a full copy of it online. But in this scenario, right, we've got Paul Hill involved. And Paul Hill is at the Rand Corporation Institute for Public Policy Management, heading program for reinventing public education. So these scenarios, right, are playing with the involvement of, right, not just Rand Corporation, but by extension, right, the Rand Corporation's PPBS through its public-private planning of these school choice partnerships and community wraparound partnerships. They also mention in here, this is an interesting little note here. So we'll just read the prelude here. It says, whether the state takes over Seattle's education system as in Rio or the city as in the change, these scenarios suggest that Seattle's current system of education becomes susceptible to administrative gridlock and may require the kind of radical change suggested by Paul Hill, right? In other words, decentralization through public-private school choice partnerships, right? Through the various charter schooling partnerships. And then, right, you could interlock those with some of the wraparound partnerships. And then obviously to facilitate that, you'd need your ed tech infrastructure and your virtual charter infrastructure in particular. So the next one says, the promise of new technology is immense. There is no need to repeat here the list of innovations recorded in the box on the information revolution. Large parts of the new information infrastructure are already in place. The availability of existing software and hardware is predetermined. The uncertainties lie in the wetware, or human beings. Right? I have a whole book called Wetware. It's all about the history of theories of biocybernetics, right? So basically, it's a treatise on the ways in which, right, biology is essentially an organic computing system, right? And it's called Wetware. But right, so it's interesting that it's kind of referring to us with the same sort of verbiage as that refers to the technology itself, but then it's telling us that the impediments to achieving our goal, right, the objectives of our scenario plan, it's not the software and hardware, right? That's predetermined. We already have the schematics for how to build it. We can only move as fast as we can in terms of, right, production, and we can only evolve the transistor capacity at the rate of Moore's law, right? So that's right. The speed of that is predetermined, and we're pursuing it as quickly as we can. There's nothing in the way. The thing that's slowing us down is basically human beings, whether or not they will adopt it and comply with, right, the behaviors that we want them to exhibit, right, in this technocracy. But let me pause. Let me jump in. I want to see if I can find that quadrant. I think it's in here somewhere. But
I mean, I don't have any questions per se. I mean, it does. I see a plan here, I guess. But it's there's a lot of deep, like, the thing is that when I read in San Francisco Unified School District, you will see that sort of double speak of something that is said that it's like trying to be inclusive, trying to get stakeholders involved and things like that. I do see similar language here. They don't admit that they're just imposing. They're doing a social engineering operation, that they're trying to control people and make them go a particular direction. This is a very cursory view of what you've shown us.
Yeah. this model kind of puts into perspective some of the things we've covered, right? So here's your cybernetics with your hardware, software, right? The choice is the privatization. That's the PPBS, the public planning, right? Integrated with the broader economy. And then these sort of psychological techniques, we haven't really broken them down quite as much, but right, we have talked a little bit about group psychology, not so much developmental psychology. Right. And so how all these different, like, sort of, you could call them systems dynamics, right, feed together, right, into as we move into the 21st century. I wanted to show, let me just do this real quick. So here's the actual, here's their quadrant graph for that document. So,
and if I understand right, the Rio scenario is basically the state just takes control of the district.
Yeah, but the ideal one was the change, and that was the one
Right.
where they had Paul Hill, right? Paul Hill's ran public-private ran corporation project,
right? And I think
so. And
that's preferable. Is that the change version is one where you are effectively changing hearts and minds along the way, and you get to the same place that you get to through Rio, but people agree to it, and it seems less imposed. It is more a developmental process, and whereas the Rio one is like the state reveals itself as the iron fist, takes its glove, takes off the velvet glove, and says, "No, this is how it's going to go."
Right. And as you're saying that, I'm thinking about just the ways in which. See, I think something that's baked into this aggregate of systems dynamics, group dynamics, and scenario planning is they want to hijack the best of both the two dominant economic models of the 20th century. One being laissez-faire capitalism, the other one being sort of centralized state-run communism. They want to synthesize or aggregate the productive capabilities of sort of the laissez-faire, the liberties embedded in the capitalist system with sort of the efficiency, right? So that centralized statecraft of the communist state, right? So, like, in other words, like, was the famous critique, The Naked Cat, a Communist by Skousen. I think it was Cleon Skousen, right? And his whole critique was that, right, well, in the Soviet Union, because there wasn't competition, you didn't have this as much economic growth, and you didn't have, if you were only going to make whatever you were going to make for the day, you couldn't make more by working harder or extra hours, right? That the productive engine wasn't necessarily as efficient as it was in a market-based system, in a capitalist system, where the worker had an incentive to put in extra energy, right? But in that system, right, the worker has this incentive to put in this extra energy, right, and potentially maybe earn some more capital, right? But then because you're allowing for this free market exchange, right, all of that energy goes in different directions, right? It doesn't go into the centrally planned direction of, what are the goals of the state economy, right? As far as the different sectors, right? Like what does the state need in terms of production and consumption, right? So in this way, right, the scenario planning, right, it drives everything toward a centralized goal, but it leaves enough sort of freedom so that you can extract the creative energies, but basically put borders on it where that creative energy can't go outside of the circuit, right? So that you work as if you're in a laissez-faire system, but necessarily, right, it's this illusion that you're working towards your own goal, where all of these options that you think are yours, right, are constantly being steered back into the ideal scenario of, right, the central planners. That's something that I intuit based on what I've looked at thus far. It seems like that's baked into not just the aggregate of the models, but the psychological principles and mechanisms embedded in it. Right. So in other words, like, so the Rio one is like, oh, you don't want that. You want to work towards the change. Well, the change is actually the state. It's just the state as much as Rio is the state. Right. It's just right. So, like, So you sort of create these tension of these, right, these different scenarios, right? And you can sort of corral the energy of the workers into, right, the change as if, right, well, that's the one where everybody is, healthy and rapid change. We're working together and stuff, and the real ones where the government runs everything, except, right, they're two sides of the same, public-private planned economic coin, right? Like that's, but the tension between those two scenarios and the gamification of the moving parts, right? It incentivizes people to play as if it's it's not all sort of a predetermined outcome, to more or less, right?
Yeah, I mean, certainly what they're counterposing healthy to turbulent. Turbulent means there's a resistance, and in fact, on the other quadrant, as you go down the y-axis, that in addition to that change being slow, when the state has to impose it, they put that word resistant, like you've got people fighting you doing it. What is the implication is that healthy change is non-resistant change, where there's no conflict, and it also is faster. So it is this, to me, that's their dream. Their dream is, can we just get people to do what we tell them and not resist it and actually embrace it? And we can do it quickly that way. And they recognize that it's harder when you have to actually bring the boot down, it's harder to get where you want to go.
Right. And then, and they know that too much punishment and negative reinforcement weakens morale, which makes you less productive. Right. It's even a step deeper than that. Can we get them to internalize the values and the objectives of the system in ways where, we're always going to give them commands and nudges and directives through reified through the whole system of the culture and the media and all the institutions. But if we model the systems of systems in such a way where they adopt or assimilate, right, they internalize the values and the objectives of the whole system, that those nudges can be very, very subtle. And the other part is that they can also extract or capitalize on the innovation. And Aldous Huxley talked about in Brave New World when they come up with hypnopedia, and it's basically it's subliminal subconscious conditioning as opposed to the behavioral conditioning. They do both in the novel, but they said, well, we found that the subliminal stuff is really only useful what they call moral education, and all it really meant was that, right, morals are a priori. They're values that you hold before you come to a situation, and they guide your behavior in the situation, right? They determine the decisions you make. You're going to make them so that they uphold the values, the morals, the principles, right, a priori, that you use in your schema of your own identity and the world. So if you can replace sort of the metaphysical, the moral axiology to the logos of the universe, to God, or even just like an evolutionary, natural instinct, if you can replace that with this a priori values or motivations that are actually the artifice of, right, the end games, the objectives, the values of stakeholder capitalism or DEI, social emotional learning, or public hygiene or sustainable development, then, right, not only will you be compliant and fulfill the homeostasis, but potentially you can make the system work for them even better, because you will come up with innovative ways to make the system better on your own. You will internalize it such that you will come up with ways to basically enslave yourself more effectively in ways that your own slave masters couldn't come up with, right? But yet they sort of, you could say, by proxy did come up with it, because they engineered you into a psychological state where, right, you basically you come up with it on your own, and you never know that the motivations were not your own, right? Like that's
well, and also it's very interesting again here, the very thing that they say they're trying to avoid. So we'll say turbulent and resistant. The American Revolution, the Civil War, the labor movement, the civil rights movement, literally all the things that at one way, shape, and form we are often taught to to admire and to see as the high point of human action. they're basically saying, and those things clearly came out of resistance and turbulence. They're saying, no, we need to avoid that, because that, I mean, they are really quite clearly saying the days of any sort of change, revolutionary change, are over. But in order to do that, how do we take that language of change and turn it into something, and bring it into that quadrant up in the upper right? How do we make it so that we take their language of social justice, take their language of equality and equity, take their language of fairness, and direct it into something state controlled, and get them, instead of fighting us to get to those things, they embrace us, but we're going to use that language, this is the trap that liberalism has found itself in. This is the trap that I would say most of the revolutionary socialists I've been in going with identity politics and things like that, have found that our enemies, I would call them our enemies, state and corporate, took that language of change and put it up into their quadrant and said, "Come and get it, folks. Come and join us in that quadrant. We're gonna deliver you there. We're gonna do it in a turbulence-free, resistance-free process if you just join with us."
And I'm also guessing, well, the goal is to stay on that path, right? Because we can deviate into different quadrants, right, at any point. I guess just anecdotal experience, like, it's just it seems to me that it's been very effective, with people, because when you describe people that are creating their own prison, I know people who are working in nonprofits, developing tech ed, people who consider themselves radical, but they're in there. I know people who are in nonprofits in the mission who, in the name of order, progress, and cleanliness, sanitation, and social justice above all, have, for example, turn merchants into the system of the state. These are people who have been educated in very well, like at university level, high school, whatever, in the Bay Area, where these ideas of inclusion, alongside ideas of radicalism, or resistance, are actually docile players of the system. And they actually play like a they defang any sort of possibility for that turbulence, right? That it, at least we believe it is necessary, that, because that's how history is moved, and kings didn't lose their protection of being anointed by God just because, and so on and so on. So yeah, so this process, I can see it. It's been in play. It's like, it didn't happen just last week. It didn't happen 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 95. It's a long road that I think is actually very effective, and it's scary because, again, COVID, right? Like, the people that were the most educated, at least in my experience, were the people that fell in line the hardest, and were unable to see outside, this construction that also we think comes organically from grassroots. That's another word that is thrown around, like, grassroots movements, and none of these ideas, about like identity and all this stuff, like, they're not ours. They're curated through these systems, through these institutions, through all these people. And yeah, I'll leave it at that.
And Eduardo, you might want to say something, because I was about to say something in relationship to what Kenny says, because this might be one area where I'm critiquing, I guess, what you're saying, Jake. So, Eduardo, before I say it, do you want to go and get in there?
No, I want to hear your critique.
So I'm thinking about San Francisco Unified right now. San Francisco Unified is being threatened with state takeover, and I guess when I think about 2020, when I think about COVID was was essentially still in that, it was in that one quadrant they were trying to avoid. Because I do think our rulers would rather avoid it. It's harder to do it when the state has to come in and impose it. But in each case, the state has been forced to come in, whether you think of COVID, whether you think of education. They're having to keep coming in and abandoning their plan of social engineering done the nice way. And I think that indicates that their management of people isn't as locked down as we thought. That's not I don't celebrate them doing those things, but it tells me that that's one of the pieces of evidence that tells me that their mechanism for prediction is not as good as what they think. And I would say we might be giving them too much credit. I definitely think that they are attempting to do this, but I don't necessarily see the wizard mastery when I think about how this stuff is played out. Over and over again, they are having to bring the boot of the state and reveal their hand in ways I don't think they want to, which I think is a problem for them as time goes on. That's one piece of it. There's another piece where I do believe that much of these plans that were hatched about control were hatched at a time when the U.S. empire was the dominant power. They start right out of post-World War II, and through the 40s and 50s and 60s and 70s, even up to the 90s with the end of the Soviet Union. And I personally, even though I think you brought up these two like people from China and things like that, this is a Western plan. This is a Rand Corporation plan. I know that they're not the only players, but which I see as the West, and I believe that it does not take into account. It assumed that everyone on the globe was going to be an object in some ways in relationship to Western domination and Western control. Well, now what's happening, in my opinion, is there is another controller moving in on the system. Not the working class, unfortunately, but another section of the capitalist class that I don't think was taken into account when these models were put in play or even thought of. And I personally believe that those are creating more complications in the planning, if you want, and not just the linear planning, but to take in all the information, because the data that the U.S. is not collecting is being collected by China, and that's what this TikTok shit is about. That is what the vax programs are about. Where who gets to collect whose data, and so to me, I do believe this is what the U.S. ruling class is doing. I believe this is what the Chinese ruling class is doing, but I think neither of them has the kind of the iron grip, if you will, that maybe is implied in what you're putting forward, Jake.
Well, so scenario planning by design, by nature, is not an iron grip, right? It's the nature of it. It's more. It's very Bruce Lee. It's very be like water. It's very, I can crash or I can flow. I can go fast or I can go slow. I'll make it, based on the data I get, I'll make the adjustment I need. Maybe it's effective for me to show my iron hand. Maybe, it's sometimes more pressure is good and sometimes, and it's just measuring, right? Are we getting the reactions we want? So we looked at Lockstep, right? That's a scenario planning document. I would wager that COVID itself was action research. Now they got a signal. Look, before COVID, right? There was, remember the Ebola scare, right? And then there was H1N1, and then even the Nightmare's birth. They've done this many, many, many times, right? And then they've done it during the years of social media. Each one of those, right? They do a propaganda scare. They look and see, how do people respond? What groups do they get into, right? What are the different reactions? Who are the figureheads, right? How can we map out this ecosystem, right? And then eventually, right? So that's just getting data. The action research is where you try out one of your scenarios. And then you go, oh, okay, well, we found out that one of the things you're looking at is how much pressure can they take? How much, what's the right recipe of stick to carrot, right? Like, they don't care. As long as you do what they want, they don't care if they have to use sticks or carrots or both. I mean, that's like, and here, I just want to note this. I'm implying that that the game plan is a global game plan, right? And that it does involve, right, intersections or alliances across the Anglo-American establishment and what has become the BRICS bloc today. Remember, okay, I got to share screen. That guy that I mentioned, I think it's William Owen. Remember William Owen?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. William Owens. Okay, he was the architect of Revolution Military Affairs, System of Systems, okay, which aggregates your group dynamics, your system dynamics using cybernetics. And then he also focused in on network-centric warfare. I don't want to go through everything he's involved in up here, okay? But I found some military paperwork where they announced him as a Rhodes Scholar, but when you go to the Rhodes Scholar database, he's not in there. So I have him there tentatively, but he definitely is a member of the CFR and was either a chair or a CEO or some high-ranking officer in a bunch of these tech companies that came out in the 90s, just after the emergence of net-centric warfare strategy, okay, which is sort of an offshoot of fourth generation warfare. But the important one is Amerilink. At Amerilink, he was on the board of directors, and Amerilink was one of the first companies to try to bring Huawei into the American market. This is a guy that's not just, right, at the RAND Corporation. He's also senior military assistant to the U.S. Secretary of Defense. He's the U.S. Navy Admiral. He was in the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff. That's the highest ranking military officer in the country underneath the Secretary of Defense. If I went into some of these other tech companies or telecommunications stuff, the guy that's in the systems of systems that works for the RAND Corporation, Revolution Military Affairs, right? Integrating net-centric warfare, is on the boards of all these tech companies, and is part of the actual United States military, and is trying to basically do business with Huawei. You could say it's some kind of keep your enemies closer thing, and you could, if you integrate them in your network, then, you can see what they got, but then they can see what you got. So that doesn't make sense to me unless it's basically a shell game, right? Like the whole, it's a closed circuit is what I'm getting at.
I don't know if we want to have the debate over, like, because I do think you have to finish your thing. Because for me, I'm perfectly happy seeing those things and seeing them very much as the relationship between the U.S. and China in the 80s is different than it was in the 90s, and definitely different than it is in 2020. And China has played an active role in developing its changed relationship from one where it knew the United States was using it, but it would develop its resources as it was being used as a bulwark for U.S. penetration into Asian markets and competing with the Soviet Union at one point in time, and actually pressuring the Soviet Union and part of collapsing the Soviet Union. And then China had to figure out how to develop itself while not revealing the hand that it might be a threat. Well, now everyone knows China is no longer hiding it. And the RAND corporations put out document after document basically saying we have to change our policy from cooperation to competition. And that was put out in 2021. So the RAND corporation is saying it. So to me, these things evolve and they change, just like systems and intersystems do. It's just they're not all controlled by one party. That's the difference in the view we have.
Right, but I would just see the change in competition to cooperation or vice versa is only the difference in the instance that we're in a competition phase. The difference is the tension and the way that the tension changes behavior, versus if we're in a cooperative phase, how the release of tension changes behavior, right? And so the tension would be, right, a negative stimulus, right? And the release of that would be a positive stimulus, aversion, attraction, right? In order to move intergroup dynamics on a geopolitical, right, scale, like regional, hemispherical. That's what I would wager is the substantive difference ultimately.
As I see it, what you're saying is the the cooperation model of U.S.-China relations is not functionally different than the competition model. They are both vehicles to essentially control a population using different different tensions and different. That I guess that's what I hear you saying.
Yeah, I mean that, look, you could say that, well, we're in a competition phase. Well, you're not competing so much that you kicked Zhu Min out of Princeton.
Yeah, let's try to wrap up, so we can always do a part 2. So at this moment, I'd like for us to sort of share
what I would say is maybe the question, because we've been going a long time, and the question maybe for you, Jake, is what is your, because you got to give this presentation in Moldova, and you're going to give this online somewhere else. What is your takeaway from this discussion so far? That's what I would say.
What is my takeaway?
Yeah, in relationship to, you got to give a presentation and things like that.
My takeaway is I got way too much stuff to fit in a 20-minute presentation.
I think so. I do think so. I think you're gonna have to do some work to
well, that's why I wanted to do it here, because I know you love to hear me stumble around.
Yeah.
And
to me, the central thing is to me, one of the big things was the relationship between what we call these state capitalism, I call state capitalism, these kind of centralized plans of running, and how they're being integrated with sort of this other fluid, nonlinear systems, and how, to me, they sort of lead to a better understanding of things like data collection as part of an architecture of overall social control and social engineering and changing humans through it. And obviously the cyborg thing and putting chips into people's bodies is part of it. But it's like what you said, MK Ultra was just the beginning of them experimenting with altering people. And we have to understand that there are so many ways, from education to finance to obviously the media and government is basically operating with a social control kind of agenda, and it does that through an understanding of groups and controlling and directing groups as a way of reaching an individual. But it does work on the relationship between those two things as well, and the interrelationships of the groups. So that's the takeaway from me as your big take-home message.
Well, let me hear what Kenny and Eduardo, before I say anything. Like, let me hear if what I said made enough sense to either of you.
What makes sense is that there are a lot of connections between the different actors or different players that are working like together. I think what I'm always amazed by, what you and Alison always do in this approach, is draw the lines to how the people are in connection to either, money, power, or other forces that are at play. Like I really appreciate. So what I would like, it did go broad, right? But I mean, for me, in my area of like school choice, for me specifically, it's always, how do we tie this to how we're doing this at a early age, at very early age, with kids and students, and that's, to me, the most important thing. Like I just don't think these things are happening with older folk. I think it's happening with students that are younger. Why don't you go ahead, Kenny, as I gather my thoughts. Go ahead.
So I've been recently thinking a lot about the big picture, like this beast or this creature we're trying to make out, like that's coming, right? Like, and So what I take from this is that there is people who have thought ahead, right? Like the possibilities, right? The scenarios, like you were saying, and how to navigate the scenarios. And in your presentation, at least maybe because I'm biased, reinforces this notion that there are people who are trying to control populations because they know, when we talk about the Malthusian situation, that there are potential moments of chaos, disorder, or a threat to their system, to the pyramid that we're in, in that they don't leave any stone unturned, that there are many people that play a part in the process of trying to control and influence how we think, right? And you shared, like the individual and the collective and the systems and in the connections, like Eduardo said, between the different institutions, whether they be educational, military, like global governance bodies, and so the point is that yes, there's people trying to exert an influence on the outcome, because as a Marxist, I see it from a materialist, I guess, way, in the sense of like the economic, socioeconomic system that they have in place is in crisis, and they knew it was going to come to a point, and so this is how they've tried from decades ago to try to insert themselves into our lives in order to guide that process, to make sure that they have the outcome that they need in order to maintain, again, the order of things, and to push us even further, right, into to deal with what we call the contradictions of the system, right? Like more, and because this ties into, maybe this is a proposal I'll have later, Fabio Vighi, who focuses a lot on economics and the excess of people, because I've lately been thinking a lot about this vaccine stuff, right? Like we haven't gone back to it in terms of the actual health effects, right? Like, because there's people who are still looking at this, and we haven't. Yes, of course, the mechanisms of control, the blockchain, the passports, the the influence, how people came to accept that period, right, of COVID with little to no resistance. Yes, all that, but it brings me back to Malthusian shit, because the system will no longer lead a lot of people. And I think at one point I kind of glossed over, and so people are going to be expendable even more, as we're being replaced. And so how are we going to be funneled into the meat grinding systems that they will need to, maybe perhaps, like, and it sounds too far-fetched, but I think the roadmap that you've displayed here is what gives me a little more of a picture of, oh, this is how they get this is how COVID happened, because that was such a traumatic thing for me, in looking at it in awe, and again, and it's not over, it's an ongoing thing, and so that's how I make sense of this. I hope, like, it makes sense to people, but for me, this is one more piece of the puzzle of what the hell is going on, what the hell they're planning. But this does give me some more clarity into, like, oh, this is how we end up with these ideas that we think are ours.
You unfinished, Eduardo?
Yeah. I think what, like, as Kenny was thinking, Kenny was speaking, I was thinking about also how what you have shared is not something that has just started just a few years ago. This has been going on, as you mentioned, in the history of even
70 plus years.
I mean, right, exactly. Going and what the CIA and trying to keep mind control going and trying to control populations with, I'm not just referring to population growth, by the way, I'm talking about like really like mind control, not just for the purpose of advertisements, but to control people's way of thinking. And the experiment that I hadn't thought about in the angle that you gave it with COVID, I can see how there will be more experiments like that continuously happening in our lifetime to try to see what works and what does not work to try to control us. And so this has been going on for a long time, and that's the scary thing, that it's not they're not giving up. Like the government, all the entities involved, all the institutions that you've just mentioned, how much investment there is, the the importance of every single one of these actors and players interconnected to try to get us to think alike or think to be to obey. um, so yeah.
Okay. So good. Well, thanks. I listen to y'all. I think I might have figured out a couple ways to condense or make more concise. So yeah, if I were to recap, and I think it sounds like
And
y'all gather. Yeah, go ahead.
no, I wouldn't say curriculum, but the systems that are being used in education, or what you shared with us in that document, where I think it was like a PDF. Like there are strategic ways that have been planned to try to get us all to fit into this model of how we should behave or act. I mean, it's not. There's a lot of time and energy investment in all of this.
Yeah, I guess the thing, Andy, what you were gonna say something?
All I'm going to say is that if you're only given 20 minutes, I think you are not going to be able to spend as much time on the evidence of your theory as explaining the theory itself. And what you could do, I don't know how many people are going to this, is you could create a little mini document that has the key pieces of evidence that you want to cite. Like they would maybe show some of the graphs on your thing, but just people could have like a handout so that you don't have to do all that work of evidence, that you can say, look, because it's very important to you. I know from your book, I just know from knowing you, you want people to know that you're just not making shit up. But I think you may have to understand that your presentation is going to be what you might describe as making things up. You know, your view of it, your theory on how to understand what these folks have been doing and how it's been altering and how it's been being refined and actually broadened, really, to include more things into it as it tries to draw more into it. Because MK Ultra is small time compared to what you're talking about now. And so I think you may have to just make choices of the evidence. You can't spend as much time as you might want to on evidence in your presentation.
Yeah,
it makes sense though. Also, to back up what you're saying, I think people are going to question, like, well, why are you making these ties? How do you know? Like, obviously, the evidence will demonstrate that. But maybe if you have it as I don't know, a backup for how people would like to further look into this.
It's not a bad idea. Like maybe like an infographic style, little like with some citations for each slide or something like.
And I honestly, I love seeing those graphs, like the graphs from the documents and the stuff that Charlotte Iserby. So you pick the things. It's very attractive to go looking in some of those sorts of things, and it really helps support you without having to spend all that time on it. So I really think if you can just give yourself time for your talk so people know what you're trying to talk about, and you then offload your evidence into something physical in people's hands, I think you'd have a really impressive presentation.
Thank you. So the main things that I think that I added, I've been on the show many, many times, right? We've talked about school choice, public-private partnerships, ed tech, and data tracking. We've talked about all. So I think if there's something that I presented here that y'all hadn't heard from me before, it largely has to do with the ways in which the systems dynamics and the group dynamics are basically the models that the data goes into.
Yeah.
And so I had always kind of, in many ways, conceived of a lot of the ed tech looking at all of us as like little individual widgets on a conveyor belt, right? And then we're going to output the data so that this widget comes out from the conveyor belt and goes to sector B, where it's going to pull lever A, and then this one comes out and it's going to, push button C, and right on sort of this like atomized scale. But what I had discovered from, what I just laid out is that there is another layer in which that data is sifted into these group dynamic models or algorithms. And then that's all of the different identity politics stuff. And that fits into the systems of the fourth industrial revolution. So stakeholder capitalism, sustainable development. And so hopefully that gives us all a better sense of what's being done with the data. So, right, if I can condense that part when I get into the school stuff, which we'll talk about next time, that terrain I'm familiar enough with it to know what's too much, what's enough.
Yeah.
This other stuff is sort of more the theory and the history, and hopefully it made enough sense in that regard. But we got close to everything. Go ahead.
I think the way you just said it right there would be a great way, actually, to in many ways start your presentation, because you're basically laying out some of the basics that most people will be familiar with, that are not just basics, and then you can say, but here is what how I had thought about this, and here is how I now think about it. Now let me tell you about this revelation that, or new way I'm thinking.
Yeah,
because I think most of us thought in that conveyor belt, individualized sort of way.
Yeah. I wouldn't have. I needed to stumble around and ramble to figure out how to shorten it up like I just did. So, all right. Well, next time then, whenever we plan for the follow up, it's actually a good place to stop, honestly, based on what's left. Like the only thing that we might have covered to like be a nice segue would have been to get past the Delphi stuff, but pretty much everything else that we didn't cover was just looking at all the different partnerships between these different school choice organizations, the Hudson Institute, the Rand Corporation. So it would show you how those institutions are connected to these track and trace systems, and then that would show you how the school system basically fits into everything else. Yeah. So in other words, next time we can just look at the school stuff, and we went macro here, we'll go micro there, and
I like it. Right. Jake, I appreciate you taking the time to go through this with us.
Well, I appreciate y'all letting me practice my not best material.
You and I have some editing ahead of us.
All right. Well, this was a very lively discussion, and we're going to have another part to this, which will definitely be the part of how it is connected to like school. So I would look forward to that. All right, let's do this. All right, well, thank you, Jake, for being here. Again, that's Jake with us, the author of School World's Order, the Technocratic Globalization of Corporatized Education by Train Day Books, and he is a contributor to New Politics, the Center for Research on Globalization, Op-Ed News, the Intrepid Report, the Dissident Voice, and Unlimited Hangout. Right. We are, what's left is a weekly political podcast / channel challenging the mainstream left. We post information about our topics and our guests on the episode notes where we found this episode, or on our blog at what'sleftpodcast.com. You can find past episodes to the podcast / channel there and connect with us. I remind folks, if you like anything you've heard here, please subscribe, rate, review, turn on your notifications to any of our platforms on Spotify, iTunes Podcast, BitChute, Odyssey, YouTube, Rumble, or Telegram. You can also find our blog and any of those links in the episode notes wherever you found this episode. If you would like to give us feedback about something you've heard, or suggest something for us to cover, contact us through our blog, or if you want a shout out like Andy is doing, just contact him and he'll give you a shout out. I'm Eduardo Varca, co-host Kenny Cepeda, and thank you, Jake, for being with us. We'll catch you all next time. Ciao. Thank you for listening.